Good afternoon to everyone. I'm here in this role to conduct a panel discussion on the theme topic, which is TCM, the mantra for business success in turbulent times. We had originally planned on having 4 panelists other than me. Now we have only 3. And I can understand why the 4th panelist doesn't come. He is Subhaya Viswanathan. For those of you who are from this town would know that the occasional bulletins that were coming from Apollo Hospital were signed by Subhaya Viswanathan on the condition of the Chief Minister. And obviously, these have been difficult times, and therefore, apparently, I was told that he hadn't slept for 3 days, and therefore, so he's not here. So we have 3 panelists. Again, from mix of industries, we have Mr. Seshagiri Rao, who's the Joint Managing Director of JSW Steel. We have Ramesh Kaimal, who is the Chairman and MD of Gamesa Wind Turbines. And we have Mahesh Anand, who is the President Decoratives of Nippon Paints. And I will try and provide a perspective from an ITN, although I retired 3 years back, and since then I've been involved in different industries, but still. We keep getting into these turbulent times periodically. And I thought I'll just introduce the topic from what we had earlier from my personal experience, which was in 2008, when the financial meltdown took place. And my company, Tata Consultancy Services, is a global organization with about 92% of the revenues at that time coming from overseas. We were a little over $6 billion in terms of revenue at that time. Now TCS is close to $16 billion in terms of revenue. And after a long period of time, not after a long period of time, right from the time that we forayed into overseas markets in 1974 till 2008, I don't think there has been any quarter when we have had any reduction in growth. It has been a continuous growth. Of course, we were a very small company at one time and kept growing. But 2008 was a very big check on us, because that was the first time. In September, we had, of course, September of 2008, we had posted very good figures. And as you know, 16th of September is when Lehman event took place, and thereafter there was. And December of 2008 was the first time that the revenues of revenues in that quarter was lower than the revenue of the previous quarter. And one of the things that we had to do at that point in time was to really look at how we are managing ourselves, because at that, it was evident that it was going to take some time for the global economy to take, to become better. And therefore, as an organization which was not only global, but also had a phenomenal amount of concentration on the banking and financial services and insurance industry, BFSI as we call it, and which was really the lead characters who were going through the issues, and of course everyone else followed that after that. So what do we do? So at that point in time, we took a decision that, there were 3 of us, which was Mr. Ramdurai, who was the MD at that point in time, Chandra, who was the Chief Operating Officer, who is currently the MD and CEO of TCS, and myself. We essentially were looking at how I was the Chief Financial Officer at that time. So how do we look at this whole scenario, and what do we do to manage in that? So one of the things that we decided was that while the revenues would be in question, revenue growth would be in question, but we need to make sure that from a margin and therefore the absolute profit was concerned, we should be in a position to deliver equal, if not higher figure as we went along. And by, we were going through this process in, as I said, September that took place. September was also a time when we took a very major decision in terms of acquiring another company, which is about $500 million or a little over $500 million in terms of purchase at that time of a unit of Citibank in India, in terms of which was providing outsourcing services to Citibank at that time, and largely on the BPO side. And so we were active on that. We continued with that acquisition process and so on till December. So by February, we had come to that was the time when strategy was to be presented. I'm painting these dates and so on for the simple reason that we had to make a statement as far as February of 2009 was concerned as to what we are going to do in 2009 and 10 to the board of directors. And so we decided that we are going to say that we are going to improve our margins. And we had a very fierce competitor at that time, and I don't want to give the name, but all of you would have guessed that, the IT industry, outsourcing and so on, who had a much higher margin. So we decided that we would show that we would grow by 400 basis points in terms of operating margin. We were operating at 23% at that time, operating margin, so we had to go up to 27%. How are we going to achieve that 27% was not something that we had not done anything beyond the back of the envelope calculation at that time. And once we made that statement, obviously that statement implied that we had to have a change in the business model, change in the manner that we are going to be approaching the whole, the global customers and clients. Also, it meant considerable. One of the key drivers in the business of IT and IT outsourcing was what we call the on-site offshore ratio. While the revenues would be lower on offshore, the margins are much higher as far as offshore is concerned. So it makes a lot more sense to operate from here. But there is, in simple terms, the revenue gap between on-site work and offshore work is something like 1:2. 1:3. So that means that the revenue of one in offshore work for one person year or whatever it is would be 3 times that if that person goes on-site. And therefore, you have to bridge the revenue gap as well. It's not as though we can work on that, but this gives you a better margin as far as, and that means that building up a lot of capacity within India in terms of being able to grow, because if you are going to be shifting the on-site. There are many other issues with regard to HR, with regard to shifting people, with regard to reorienting the approach that we have and so on. So I'm not going to get into each of the cost drivers that we looked at that point in time, and each of the revenue drivers that we looked at that point in time. But it required a very detailed kind of calculation that we had to do. So in 5 quarters, starting from June of 2009 till June of 2010, we had delivered, as against the promise of 400 basis points, we had delivered 410 basis points. And that was, to me, is something that the organization went through a great transformation process at that point in time in terms of completely re-looking at the business model, changing our customer orientation as to what we are going to be promising. Of course, as far as the customer is concerned, it was certainly a welcome approach because the revenues would remain, the budget could, while remaining the same, could account for far greater effort, provided we ensure that we are able to do that in a seamless fashion, do that in a very efficient fashion, and so on. So that was a great value proposition as far as the customer is concerned. But again, it was very different in terms of dealing with the customers and making sure that the service levels don't go down and so on. So the story is, just to, while it is a business model, was my organization capable of handling it at that point in time. And there I'll have to essentially say that we had gone through a journey about 10 or 12 years before that, where within the organization we had built up a fairly good cost monitoring system. And to the extent that we had done some sort of pioneering work with regard to software project management, and embedding the cost driver concept within that, and making sure that each project leader knew where the efficiencies existed as far as our project is concerned, and be able to take a decision. And we also came up with things like, for instance, if there is a change, is that a change because we didn't understand the original requirement of the customer, or was it a change that was impacted by the customer making coming up with a new requirement and so on, and therefore, one had a billing outcome, another one, if it was our own understanding and so on, didn't have a billing one. And why did we not understand the customer in the first place? So there are many things that we had built up as far as the costing system is concerned. And therefore, we had something that was going with us in order to be able to do that. So this is a long story. So I'm going to stop here to tell you that, one, there is a top management involvement that is very critical, because, as I said, there were three of us who were essentially very closely working together in that. And to understand that, it goes beyond the finance function, because it is not something where I can go ahead and say that this is what I want to change. There has to be an acceptance by everyone, and there was a cross-functional, if you will, in terms of understanding. Third, it was tool-based, and because we had built it up over a period of time and so on, and also we had an ERP at that point in time. And fourth, there was a very, very rigorous measurement that was really taking place on a periodic basis, to the extent that we could go ahead and deliver that. So with that, I'll give you, I'm going to stop my this thing with regard